we're going to learn how to create this beautiful transition using the tab view, and we're going to use GeometryReader to detect the X position so that we can get a very nice parallax effect. I promise it's not as hard as it looks, and also we're going to learn a lot of interesting techniques along the way. Let's go back to Xcode, and we're going to start with the home view, in which we have the featured item, which is this card right here. Next, we're going to use the tab view. If you remember, we used the tab view to create a built-in tab bar. But in this case, we're going to use it to create a horizontal pagination. So to do that, first we're going to wrap this inside a tab view. When you do that, you're going to see nothing because typically you need to set the tab bar item. But in this case, we're going to change the tab view style to page instead. And when you do that, you're going to see a portion of it, which is why we're going to need to set a frame with a height of 430. At this moment, we can play, and you're going to see that it doesn't really do anything. And that's because we need more than one item. So we can command click on featured item and make it repeat 5 times. When you do that, you're going to be able to swipe from left to right, just like that. So you can see it's very easy to set a very simple horizontal navigation as long as your content is full width. If you want to remove these little circles for the pagination, we can set .page parentheses index display mode and then set dot. Now we can select never. It's going to hide it. Secondly, we also want to separate the background from the cards, and we're going to go to featured item, jump to definition, select on it. Here, if you scroll down a little bit, you're going to find the overlay as well as the background blob. So let's cut the background blob and then go back to home. Then we can put that background blob right after the frame. So when you resume this, you're going to see that it's separate from the actual cards, and it creates this beautiful transition where one doesn't move and the other one does. Especially with the blur material, it creates a very interesting effect. And that's all we needed to do if you have a simple horizontal scroll. But we can't stop here. We want to make it even more interesting using parallax and some animations. So let's do that. But first, we're going to add some data so that each of these cards are going to look a little bit different. So we're going to create the data model. We're going to right click on the model folder and then new file, SwiftUI view. We're going to name this one course. Now we can delete the views, and we're going to start the data model struct course of type identifiable so that we can loop it using an ID. First, we're going to set the ID itself, and we're going to auto-generate using UUID parentheses. And at the same time, we have a default value. Then we're going to set each of those variables in the UI, including var title of type string, then var subtitle of type string as well, var text of type string, var image of type string, and finally var logo of type string. Now for the data, if you don't want to repeat these steps, as we've learned before, you can always copy and paste from the actual content. So let's create the sample data. It's going to be called var courses, and we're going to set an array using square brackets. Then we're going to call our course data model parentheses, and then we're going to fit the content that we want, and including the title, the subtitle, the text, the image. So at this point, it's pretty time consuming, so I'm just going to copy and paste from the content, just like this. So we have SwiftUI for iOS 15, the subtitle, the text, and the illustration, as well as the logo, which can be found in the assets folder So there's nothing confusing about this. All right, once that we have the data, we're going to go back to home view, and instead of using for each 0 to 4, which is 5 items, we're going to set courses from our sample data. And we can resume this. It's going to give us exactly the amount of items that we have in the data. We just need to make the featured item customizable. So we're going to jump there, and we're going to set the variable. It's simply going to be called var course of type course, which is the data model, and we're also going to need some sample data. In this case, we're going to call the array called courses, and using the square brackets, we're going to set the default value to 0, which is the first item. So whenever you work with an index value, it always starts with 0, which is the first item. Now, thanks to this data model, I'm going to be able to replace these values that are hard-coded, such as the logo is going to be course.logo, then the title, course.title, next, course.subtitle, and then course.text, and finally, we have the illustration, which is course.image. Next, we're going to go back to home view. Let's resume this, and we're going to need to pass the data from our array, and each item is going to be passed to the component. So course, and then I'm going to pass the item value, then resume, and voila, we have all the interesting data for the UI. Now, before we finish, I want to set a custom background for this UI here. So first, I'm going to command click on scroll view, embed that inside a Z-stack so that I can put underneath the scroll view a color. It's going to be color, and the name, I already set that in my assets. It's called background. You can see that it's off-white, and also it cuts right here because whenever you set any content, it's going to be within the save area, which means that you're going to need to set ignore save area if you want to set it to full screen. So while we're here, we are also going to organize our sections for the view so that it's easier to scan. First of all, this is the scroll detection. So I'm going to name this one scroll detection, and I'm going to create a new view right after the body. So var scroll detection of type some view, and put that code, which is a GeometryReader, including the frame. Next, we're going to put the featured items. So the tab view, cut that. We're going to name this one featured, and we're going to declare that after scroll detection. So var featured of type some view, curly braces, and paste the tab view. If you've done everything properly, it should look clean like this, and also your preview is going to work just fine. Next, we're going to start animating this UI right here by using Parallax. We're going to use GeometryReader to detect the X position. So the first thing we're going to do is to go to featured section of the UI that we have inside the home view, and we're going to wrap our featured item here, use embed. We're going to set that inside GeometryReader. Then we're going to receive the proxy in. Now you can see that we have the content that is being cut here, and that's because GeometryReader is taking the minimum size of the item, and it's going to clip the content as well. So as a result, especially if you have drop shadows or images that are bigger than the card itself, you're going to want to set some padding. Let's do padding on the featured item. It's going to be vertical, which means top and bottom, and then we're going to set it to 40. Then we're going to start detecting the X position by using the proxy value. One way to test is to add a text element using the string, and then / parentheses. We're going to show the value, so proxy and we're going to use the frame in global, which means starting from the 0, 0 position of the screen, and then right after the parentheses, get the min x position, so top left. But here's the magic. When we're going to play and when I start scrolling, you can see that this number is changing in real time, and that's exactly what we want to use for the animation. The effect that I want to use is a really fun one, and it's called Rotation 3D Effect, which allows you to set a 3D perspective on the UI. And here it needs the angle and also the axes. So let's start with the angle, which we can use the value for .degrees, and we can set to 10. Then for the axes, let's press enter. You can play with X, setting it to 1, Y setting it to 1, Z 0, and you can see it's starting to transform. It's going to be more obvious if you set the degrees to 30. You can also play with the X and Y axes. For example, Y to 0, it's going to change it. Now, we do have a problem, which is the material sheet doesn't seem to be working fine with the rotation 3D effect, and that's because of the shadow modifier. You cannot set the shadow before the rotation 3D effect, so we're going to need to move that from the featured item. So let's jump to featured item first, and we're going to get the shadow modifier, cut that, let's remove the space, go back to home view, and then I'm going to put that shadow modifier right after the rotation 3D effect. And as you can see, it's fixing our problem. Let me put back the degree to 10, and it's starting to look pretty interesting. But let's take it up a notch, because we can change this degree value here with the proxy that we're getting. So proxy dot frame dot global, and we're going to use min x. And now witness the craziness that is happening here. You can see it's very sharp and it moves way too much, which means that we can divide this value by 10 and it's going to be a little bit more soft. In fact, you can see the value changing in real time. So this number here is what's going to be applying in terms of degrees to your 3D rotation. We can also play with the axes. So for example, set the Y to 0 and it's going to look like this. If you set the Y to 1 but X to 0, then it's going to look like this, and it's really, really cool. Another thing you can do is to set dividing by -10 instead, and now we have exactly what we want, and that's pretty awesome. Next, let's apply some parallax effect. Now, what is a parallax? Well, basically is when you're seeing multiple elements moving at different speed. Think of when you're inside a car that is moving and you're looking at the landscape. So you have the mountains that move slower, and then you have the trees in front that moves faster. And that creates a really nice parallax effect. Now, in order to achieve this, we're going to need multiple elements to apply an offset modifier. And in this case, since we're using the x-axis, we're going to apply the x value for the offset. But first, we're going to need to separate the card from the image here. So we're going to go to featured item, and then I'm going to go to overlay. This overlay here, let's cut that and then bring that to home view, and I'm going to paste that right after the shadow. So since I move my overlay and it has this dynamic value, which is a course, the name is slightly different because when we're doing the for each, we're receiving the item. To be consistent, we can change the item name of the value that we're getting for each item to course. As a result, we also need to pass not item, but course. And this should solve our problem. So thanks to this, I'm going to be able to apply an offset value on the featured item separate from the overlay, which is the image. But first, I need the same value, which is the min x that I use for rotation 3D effect. And since I'm using it multiple times, it's a good idea to declare that right after GeometryReader proxy in. We're going to set let min x is equal to proxy.frameIn global min x. So as a result, I can use this value instead of this long proxy value. So let's replace that with min x. And also, I'm going to be able to reuse that in multiple places, including after the shadow for a featured item offset. We're going to use x position min x. And then we're going to apply that to our overlay image right after the first offset. And by the way, you can have multiple modifiers, including the offset. So we're going to add another one because we don't want to confuse this with the positioning. So let's set x and min x. After doing this, you're going to see a really cool parallax effect where this image is moving faster than the cards. And if you find that this is too fast, you can always divide this number by 2. And voila, this is starting to look really good. Now we can disable this text and also add a really nice blur effect. It's going to be added right after shadow, so dot blur, and we're going to set the radius using the min x, and you're going to see that it's applying some blur. Maybe it's too strong, and it's also applying only on the second card that is coming, and that's because the value that we're getting is sometimes negative. So right when you have here, which means the card that is before is a negative value, and unfortunately that won't work with the blur radius, which means that we can transform this value to always be positive. So to do that, we're going to wrap this inside ABS parentheses and then wrap at the end as well. So ABS is for absolute, and it's going to ensure that your number, even though is in the minus, is always going to be positive. As a result, you can see that both the previous card and the next card is going to have that blur effect. It's way too strong, which means that we can divide it by 40, and now we have a really nice blurred effect. Now you might have noticed that when we apply the shadow on the featured item, it's applying to everything because a modifier is recursive, meaning that if you apply a font style or a foreground style or a drop shadow, it's going to apply to every single element inside unless we clip it. So we're going to do exactly that by jumping to definition for the featured item. And you can see that here we're using the background, which is using ultra thin in, and this is not cropping, unlike the corner radius, which clips the content. So instead of doing this, if you absolutely want to clip the content but still use the rounded rectangle, we can decide to remove in for the material for the background, and we're going to add a new modifier called mask. Then we're going to use rounded rectangle parentheses, corner radius, which is 30, and the style continuous, just like before. Now this is achieving the same result, except that it's going to clip the content, and because of that, the drop shadow or any other style that is supposed to apply to inner elements will not do so anymore because it's clipped. So let me just disable the text again and just marvel at the results of my work, which is really cool. Now this also works for dark mode, so I have to stop first in order to change that. I'm going to change the color scheme to dark, and you can see that it works just fine. But the thing is, because I applied a drop shadow, some of the elements that are not clipped, including the outline, if you look at the featured item, you can see that the outline is after the mask, which means that the drop shadow is going to affect the outline. So it's not a bad idea, but as a result, my outline is going to be more visible, and maybe I want to change the opacity to be less. So for example, white here in the styles, I can set it to 0.1 for dark mode, and coming back here, and voila, I have a beautiful interaction that works just as well in dark mode as it does in light mode. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to add a beautiful horizontal scroll to your content with animation and parallax, and you can definitely have fun experimenting with your own UI here, as long as you have multiple layers for the parallax, and you just need to wrap your content inside a tab view using the tab view style set to page. And I feel just lucky to work with a framework that is just so effortless. So in the next session, we're going to create more cards underneath, and we're going to learn about match geometry effect. I'll see you then.